Thank you very much, and thank you, Christy, for a wonderful introduction and for making my excuses. I am as chagrined as anyone that we had to, set up the spring schedule at a certain point. And we did so, and we set this one, late in the semester. Thought we were safe, and we're not. I have another big deal going on out in the West Texas Historical Association is meeting. They helped me materially with this book, and the publisher's really fighting hard to get it ready for then. He said, but I'm making no promises. It's Friday and Saturday of next week out at Canyon. So anyway, I apologize for not having any books, but I do have the story. I can tell you. I want you to know that. By the way, I got to mention something that Christy said. She mentioned that award I got several years ago about the best living nonfiction writer of True West. That same year, Larry McMurtry was named best living screenwriter. Best living screenwriter. And we both agreed that we like those living than wanting memorial things. Thank you very kindly. So I'm always comforted when I hear that one. The kind of books I do are always collaborations. And I start my collaborative process here every time because we are plugged in. As a college library, we have access to interlibrary loan, and boy, I have gotten a lot of strange books through the years on interlibrary loan that I would have had a very difficult time getting my hands on otherwise, and I really appreciate it. And then we do all kinds of other things. Shay joins in the back. She did the photos. There are 100 images in this book. There were 108 or something, and we decided it would look better to the publisher, and we pared it down to 99, so we wouldn't have 100 on there. But anyway, she was in charge of that, and the publisher really has been scrambling to get this, and I got an email from him Sunday evening, and he was missing two maps that you have, and we had sent them separately, and he's lost them somewhere, but we didn't have any time to go on hunt. So I grabbed them and I ran up here. Shay was on evening duty, and she ran over to one of the machines they've got and put it on the thing and shot them right to him. Something I could never have done, and something that she does all the time. And I have, when I started this project, I went first to Sherry Baker, who had been our interlibrary loan specialist forever, and she started clicking around Billy Dixon and took his family to a homestead in Oklahoma right after the turn of the century, and he died up there. And Sherry clicked around for a minute, and here started coming stuff, and I think you got about a little over 60 pages of stuff about his estate. It was invaluable, and nobody had ever seen it before. And before we did this book, so because of that, I was going to surprise the ladies with this. They were supposed to be learning their books by now, but they don't. So I want to read the dedication page of this book. Dedicated to 3 members of the Panola College M.P. Baker Library staff who have helped me immensely with my book projects, always efficiently and with good cheer. Christy Ferguson, Director of Library Services, who arranged my exotic interlibrary loan requests for years, and who graciously has made time on the library schedule for public events featuring programs and signings of my books. Sherry Baker, reference librarian who has embraced my projects with the soul of a sleuth. No interlibrary loan request has been too obscure to elude her, and for this project she conducted an exhaustive online search which produced information that I never expected to acquire. And Shay joins, newest member of the library staff and a technological wizard. She has aided with my last 3 book projects, producing manuscripts and working her magic on the hundreds of digital images that have brought life to these books. So please join me in a thank you. In 2000, I had known about, I read about this little book on Billy Dixon. I read this thing when I was a boy. And wow, he was quite a hero, and I was really knocked out about this. And I never got around to reading this Adobe Wall's Bride, which is about a biography of his wife. Now this is supposed to be first person. His wife got him to dictate it, and it was very timely. He died when he was 62, and she got these interviews from him during the last months of his life. And so this is kind of just about like sitting down and interviewing him. And this too was based on first person interviews. This is the story of his wife's life, Adobe Wall's Bride. And but anyway, I had read the Billy Dixon book that she wrote early on, and I had admired him always. I included him a couple of times in some books, coffee table books and everything. Well, in 2016, I was president of the West Texas Historical Association, and in collaboration with them that particular year, we also had a group, the Wild West History Association, and we were meeting in Amarillo, and we chartered 4 buses, and 200 and some odd strong. We went out to the Adobe Walls thing. I had gotten as close as you could get, which is 17 miles. There's a historical marker, and it said 17 miles in this direction. I'd been by that several times, but I never had gotten to see the place. And boy, we saw it. And they asked me to give a program out there. They had tents rigged up and the microphone and everything. They asked me to give a program out there on Billy Dixon, and I knew a fair amount about him, but I'd never been out there. And it just knocked me out. When I saw the geography of this place, I thought, how in the world did he ever make the shot? It's the most famous shot ever made in the West. And so it was when after I saw it, I thought, I got to write a book. And I had one in progress at that time. And in fact, I must tell you, the one that came out just about that time was this Sam Houston book, which was the first one that the current publisher did for me. His name is Billy Huckabee. He has a group called Wild Horse Media Group. And we had the introductory event right here on the day before Sam Houston's birthday, March 1, 2016. And then we had a big event in Dallas the next day, and we had actually 2 weeks of events. And he promised us he'd get it out in time, and he did that time. But anyway, I was very satisfied with what he did. And then I was, right at that time, I was writing another one on John Chisholm, the famous cattle baron who's from Paris and is buried there and everything. He's an East Texas guy, but he took his talents elsewhere in the West after he got grown. I started contacting people, aside from the folks at this library. I got in touch with a lady who's archivist at the Haley Memorial Library in Midland. She had gotten me a treasure trove of stuff on the Chisholm thing just a few months earlier. And then through a common acquaintance, a guy named Chris Penn from England found out what I was doing through a mutual acquaintance, and he contacts me and tells me he's got a 12-page 1898 deposition that I'd never even heard of that Billy Dixon had done. And he said, would you like to have it? Oh my goodness, yes. An author friend, Chuck Parsons. Chuck made a contribution to this thing, again, without me knowing it. And my brother-in-law, I thought there was something fishy about this guy's background, Billy, the way he told it and so forth. Turned out there was. I don't have time to talk about it today, but I turned my brother-in-law loose on it. And Sherry, I think you and I looked around for this. Well, John struck gold, and there was something fishy about his background. And I get to start I think the first chapter of the book is the wedding, and then the second chapter is the mystery of Billy Dixon's background. So I wouldn't have that except for him. My daughter, Barry O'Neill Gormley, prepared the manuscript for this. And so, I had lots of help just there. And then I had the research trip of all time. I went out, I had kind of pre-planned this thing. And after church on Sunday, I drove out to Abilene, spent the night there, and I was at Frontier, Texas. It's marvelous. It's the museum they got and everything, and I got to take pictures of stuff and everything. And she promised, she said, oh boy, when that book comes out, we're gonna do a program. And so as soon as I got through with that, I drove up to Snyder and the Scurry County Museum, where I've appeared a number of times doing this kind of stuff. And I had already contacted them. And it turns out they're closed on Mondays, except the people are at work. And they said, please, come on in. So they gave me a Monday privilege, and I got there, I don't know, midday or early afternoon, and they allowed me to go all through their thing. They brought stuff out, and one of the great pleasures for me of this project was how many old buffalo guns I got to handle. They dug these things out. She got a screwdriver and pried this particularly historic buffalo gun out of its case and let me photograph it and handle it, you know, and play with it, but don't work. And so my sister says I haven't improved any since I was a kid. I'm still playing Cowboys and Indians. You know, I have not improved in many other ways too. But anyway, when I got through with that, very gracious stop that they permitted me, and all 3 staff members were there, and they too said, boy, when you get through this, we want to do a program. Sure. Well, then I drove to Lubbock. The first thing the next morning, I was on the Texas Tech campus at the Southwest Collection. And it is headed by Monty Monroe, who would succeed me in October as state historian. And then Ty Kreidler is an important staff member there. And so anyway, Ty is also the executive director of the West Texas Historical Association, and he and I worked closely together during my presidency of that thing. And so we had lunch together. I got through they were ready for me. They had stuff laid out. And so I got everything done, a lot of photocopies and everything. And then we went to lunch, and Ty wanted to know where all I was going next. And I told him, and I didn't realize what he was going to do. He started emailing and phone calling everybody he knew at these places I was about to go. And I drove from there, and I got to the Panhandle Plains Museum, which Olive Dixon helped to start. Her name, in fact, is on the entranceway as you go in to that thing. Well, I got to the Panhandle Plains Museum, and the library was about to close, but I went up and introduced myself to the guy, and he said, oh, I know all about you. Ty Kreidler just got in touch with me, and he said, look, tomorrow, he said, no, we don't open until noon on weekdays, but he said, my staff member and I will be here tomorrow at 9 o'clock. He said, you're welcome to come. So I got a morning privilege from them, and I needed it. I had to work all day with the stuff they had. In the meantime, I went hiking around the museum taking pictures, and here was Billy Dixon's Medal of Honor in a case. I had seen it before, and some of his guns and other memorabilia, and a letter from General Nelson A. Miles and so forth. And so I was back in Canyon the next day and was there all day. But when I got through in the afternoon, it was, you know, there was plenty of light left. So I drove up to Amarillo, which is a 20-minute drive from there. And I went to the cemetery where Olive Dixon was buried. Got shots of that. I found her last home, abandoned, but I had the address, and there it was. And then I went to the public library being open, and they had exactly what I had hoped to find. And so I spent the evening there, and then I went and found a motel room. The next morning was Thursday, and I drove to Fritch, not too far away. And Fritch had a Masonic lodge named after Billy, who was a Masonic brother, and it was called the Billy Dixon Lodge. And I took shots of that. And then I headed on a short distance to Borger, the seat of Hutchinson County. And they had so much stuff, it was unreal. Ty had called ahead to this wonderful lady who was in charge of things, and she did all kinds of stuff, including, she allowed me, as far as I know, it's the only recording of Olive Dixon's voice. And they had a thing from a radio interview she did. And so I had thought she was raised in Virginia, and I thought she must have that Virginia lilt to her voice. And she said, now you take this with you. I know you're good for it. Just bring it back to it, which I'm going to next week. She said, try to copy it if you can, and so forth. And so, Shay, you remember you helped me fool around with that thing. We got some of it. And so, in any event, I got to hear Olive's voice. And so then, the day was still, I still had most of the afternoon, so I drove to, it's still Miami, but they say it out in West Texas, Miami. And so I went to Miami, where Olive lived with her kids for about a dozen years. And I went to the museum there that was run by a farm woman who was a hoot. And I think she'd have given me anything I wanted if I just would stuck it in my pocket and walked out with it. She was more than generous, very gracious. And then I went to the courthouse, which was standing there. It had just been built when Olive moved there. And I bumped into the county judge. And when he found out I was the state historian of Texas, you know, he's a politician. Man, he took me all over that place. Again, more of that wonderful treatment I was getting. After that was over, I still had enough light left, and I drove almost to the Oklahoma border to find the Buffalo Wallow site, which I never had even known about. I knew what happened, but I didn't know where it was. And Olive had a marker put up there. And I found that thing late in the day and took photographs from every angle and was just absolutely thrilled. Then I drove into Canadian, spent the night, started getting phone calls from more people that Ty had contacted. And I made an appointment at the Mobeedy Museum the next day. And then I got to talk to the guy who owned the site of Fort Elliott, where Billy was stationed for about 8 years. That was his first home since running away from home. And he met me there, and I forgot what, 11 or something the next day, and he gave me a 2-hour tour of that thing. It's the cloud people. He showed me where every building was. He had photographs, and he gave me some square nails from the fort and everything. He was marvelous. And I fed him lunch. You know, they had a lunch place at Old Mobeedy, which was one of the first 2 towns in the Panhandle, Tascosa being the other one. And it was a wild, raunchy place in its heyday. And I went to the museum. And oh my God, I've been to what I thought was a museum before, the old courthouse that's there. No, they had an old school that they had gotten a $500,000 grant. It was just a 6th grade school. It had 6 rooms. And they had redone that thing completely and turned it into a wonderful museum and library. Just marvelous. And the ladies had been contacted by Ty, and they were waiting for me. And they had all this stuff put out. And by the time we closed up Friday afternoon, my car was just full of photocopies and everything else. And I thought, man, I'm tired. I'm going home. And I drove home. I pulled in the car. It was about 1 or 1:30 that night. You know, I was ready to get here. I had one other wonderful experience with that. It turned out that one of the Dixon's granddaughters is still alive, and she lives in very pleasant circumstances. I can assure you, she's comfortable in Amarillo. And when I went out to the National Cowboy Symposium to do a couple of programs, it's in Lubbock. Well, I had time in between. I drove up to Amarillo. And she greeted me, and she had all kinds of personal stuff that nobody else, and of course Ty is the one who gave me her phone number and everything. So, you know, who are these people? Billy and Olive Dixon. Billy was born in Virginia, in the western part of Virginia, and it later became, during the Civil War, became West Virginia. And he was the 3rd of 10 children. He came up with a bunch of crazy stuff about his beginnings that I won't get into now. I devoted a chapter to it in the book. When he was a boy, he ran away to the west. Actually, his family had already moved about halfway out there. They were living in Missouri, and he just went to the big river with a friend. They ran away. He never saw his people again the rest of his life. And they were just filled with the lust of adventure. I mean, this was the place to go. And he caught on with there were some woodcutter camps. Those big old steamboats use about 4 cords of firewood an hour if they're going at full steam. So they need a lot, 4 cords, cords 8 feet long, 4 feet. And so there was work. And these 2 old boys got in there with that camp, they made some work, and before long, he got hired as a bull whacker. And for the next several years, he would work as a bull whacker and as a mule skinner. Now, bull whackers, that's an ox train. And oxen are steers, but that's okay. That's what they call it. And these huge wagons can carry up to about 7,000 pounds of freight. And so they have umpteen span of oxen and no seat on the wagon. And so the bull whacker just walks along with his whipping away and keeping the team going. And a mule skinner, it's the same deal. Mules have to be fed grain. They're faster, but they have to be fed grain, whereas the oxen just graze their way to wherever they're going. And so consequently, he did both for the next several years. He worked usually for the government. And remember, the Civil War's going on at this time still. He got in on the tag end of that, and then all of a sudden the surge west is going on, and he was with these bull trains that would have 100 wagons or 200. And once he was part of a party of 600 of these things. Just unreal. And so anyway, he stayed very busy. When he first started, he hadn't fully grown up yet. He couldn't even put up he couldn't even yoke the oxen, but the old guys would help him, and pretty soon he grew. He was paid monthly. These are government jobs. And furthermore, they were going way out on the frontier, and they gave him guns. And what he was given for that first train, every time he'd sign up with a new bunch, and a lot of times he'd stay with the same bunch for a year, but they'd give him these Army weapons. And this is a Sharps carbine. And that was his first gun, and he would be using those Sharps in later years hunting buffalo. Not this. This is a carbine, and he would have a long-barreled rifle. But in any event, that's what he was given. And then, as a side arm, he and all the other guys were given these Army Remingtons. And the war ended, and they had all kinds of surplus weapons. And every time he went on a train, he got something else like this. And one time, he traded one of his revolvers for a bunch of stuff from an Indian, moccasins and things like that, He had more guns, but in any event, that was the life he lived. Growing up, he was not a talkative fellow, but he loved to listen to all those old timers talk about the adventures they had in the West, and so he grew up around these kind of guys. His one really vivid experience while he was doing this kind of work, and they went all the way to Colorado, all across the plains, and saw Indians and buffalo and so forth. But he was driving one of the 200-plus wagons that supplied the Medicine Lodge Treaty in Kansas, 1867. It was one of the biggest treaty aggregations ever. There were 5,000 Indians there. One reason they had all these wagons, they had trade goods for them. And 600 men, and he saw his first big chiefs and so forth, and so he was involved in that. By 1870, he and a buddy had decided to become trappers, and then from that, they almost immediately became buffalo hunters. These tanneries in England and back east were offering so much a hide, and there were, at the height, 60 million buffalo. And we got them down to less than 200 in just a very few years. But in any event, he got into that. It turned out he was a very, very good shot. And these are the kind of things I got to play with from museum to museum. This is a carbine for use in the saddle. But the rifle was a good deal longer than it's 30-some-odd inches, octagonal barrel, because that made the barrel stronger. And they would cheat with their cartridges. They loaded their own cartridges, and what they would do is shave off. I think I've got a slug. Yeah, here it is. This is a slug from a Sharps 50 caliber buffalo gun. That's just the bullet part. It's soft lead, and because it's soft lead, what they'd do is cut off part of it with a knife, and then they'd cram a few extra grains of powder into the cartridge, and the thing would have more power and could shoot farther. And so he's doing this, and he turned out to be an outstanding shot, and he learned to kill buffalo at about 500 yards, because if the shot didn't kill him, the buffalo would start running around and stampede the herd. And his regular shot is 500 yards, and he would make 100 of those a day, oftentimes. He learned not to shoot buffalo in the head, because buffalo skulls are so thick, their brain's about that big, and their skull is super thick that these bullets would bounce, those powerful guns, those bullets would bounce off their head. So they had to shoot for their organs. He learned just where to shoot at an extremely long range. And the buffalo rifles that he had, they didn't have telescopic sights, but they did equip them with a tang sight, a Creedmoor tang sight. This is the tang right here. And they'd put that sight right here, and it would adjust up and down, but it also adjusted to the side for windage. So it was pretty advanced for that time, and this was, versions of this would be the best rifle in the world. Well, they cleaned out Kansas pretty quickly, and he led a party down to Adobe Wall. War battle there in 1864, and these guys built a small community. There were merchants down from Dodge City, which wasn't all that far to the north, and I've given you a thing here. There were actually 4 buildings built at this place, and Adobe Wall's kind of right in the middle of the Panhandle above Amarillo, except there wasn't Amarillo. And you can see one store at the top with a rather large picket fence around a corral, and then there was a blacksmith shop, which wasn't much of a building, and then there was a saloon building, and the 3 larger buildings were built of sod, not of adobe, but they were built of sod, and they had 2 stores and a number of store employees, and the hunters were going out and killing buffalo like crazy, and the Indians decided, hey, they're killing our staff of life, and so we're going to get those guys. And a young up-and-coming chief named Quanah Parker, he was a major recruiting force. He was high energy, and he was a sharp guy, and he was supported by a very magnetic medicine man named Issatai. And I know the textbook that I used to use a long time ago in Texas history translated Issatai as coyote droppings. But I knew better, and I wasn't teaching junior high students, so I always told my students that what Issatai translates to is wolf shit. And because his life had gone so well, because he was a major medicine man, he didn't change his name. But he needed to change it after this thing. The day that the Indians decided to hit them, there were 10 guys in that upper building. There were another 10 guys in that saloon, including Dixon was around there, and there were only 6 guys, not a one of them buffalo hunters. There were several buffalo hunters here. Most of them were out hunting. But most of these guys were saloon keepers and so forth, and there was one woman in that lower building, the wife of one of the guys. She cooked. And so anyway, there were a couple of guys named Ike and Shorty Schneider. They were in a wagon that they owned. They had a bunch of oxen, and they were, as you can see, at the upper part of the map. And then there was William Oles. He was down in that bottom part. I mentioned him because I'm mentioning guys that are going to get killed in this thing. And at dawn, it just so happened, there was the reason for this, but I won't go into it, time doesn't permit. But at dawn, Billy Dixon was up and about, and so were a few other people, and Billy saw some kind of movement way off to the right, which would be the southeast. And he couldn't tell what it was. It turned out it was 600 mounted warriors headed straight for these buildings. And he thought they were headed for their horse herd, which was out grazing. Instead, they split into 3 divisions. One division stole all the horses. The other 3 divisions headed for a building each. And when he realized what they were doing, he fired one quick shot and then took off for the nearest building, which was that saloon. And everybody's hollering, forward up, and they barely got the door shut. Since these places were stores, they had hay, they had sacks of flour and such, and they threw these sacks against the doors, and I mean within seconds, the Indians were at all three buildings. They were clubbing at those doors, they were shooting at the windows, and so forth, and had there been another 30 seconds, they'd have gotten there, and there were 600 of them, and there were 28 men and one woman. And, you know, if they'd been able to get inside those buildings, well, they'd have been able to kill everybody, but instead, that didn't happen. These guys, now, the best weapons were these single shot, these are breech loaders. And so these guys later would stand the Indians off with those, but they didn't have them. They didn't have it. They had to go to their pistols because they didn't have time to reload. And I mean, it was really hairy for about half an hour. It was one of the wildest firefights I've ever written about. And the Indians laughed. They were battering at the doors. They were backing their horses up and trying to kick the doors in, and shooting. Every window was shot to pieces, and then jars of things were shot on the inside so badly that the floors were just covered with all kinds of sticky substances, and flies everywhere, broken glass everywhere. And these guys, a lot of them weren't even dressed. A lot of them just got up in their long johns and started fighting and fought in their long johns all day. And finally, though, they did drive them off, and they were not able. The Indians were not able to storm this place, and these guys got those high-powered rifles into play, and a number of wonderful shots were made, and they drove the Indians farther and farther away. Quanah Parkin himself was wounded and had to stay out there all day until he was able to creep out. They did steal most of the horses, and they killed every horse that was still there in the corral that they couldn't steal. When the day ended, they had 56 horses and 28 dead oxen. The two brothers were sleeping in that wagon that you see, and when they heard all the commotion, they just acted like, you know, nothing was going on. There they were. They were caught in there with their dog. And finally, one Indian decided to look in that wagon, and they were right. They shot him to death. But when the Indians heard that gunfire, well, they just stormed those guys and killed both of the Scheidler brothers. Billy Tyler got caught outdoors, and he was shot before he could get indoors. So those were three guys killed right away. The Scheidler brothers' dog fought so hard against the Indians who were killing his masters that they not only scalped the Scheidler brothers, they took a hunk out of the dog. And this was supposed to be an honor to the dog because they scalped him. He had fought so well. And then, when the second day started, the Indians weren't coming. They were taking such huge losses. Well, these guys finally got outside on the second day, and they found 13 dead warriors. And they cut their heads off and stuck them on posts on that corral. And, of course, that drove the Indians crazy, but they didn't do any more attacking. On day 3, 15 warriors came up. There's 2 plateaus. When you're facing each, there's a plateau. It's a long way off. I don't remember how far it was, a long way. And there's another one that's almost a mile off, farther down. And that's the one that supposedly Dixon made his shot on. And even if he made it this one, they had 2 guys. The day we were out there, they had 2 guys on this quote, quote, near plateau, and they were just specks. I got a shot of it. I may have run it in the book, I don't remember. And there were just two little specks with a good camera. And then the ones that were farther down, I don't know how you didn't see them. Anyway, there were 15 of them. And somebody said, Dixon, let's see if you can hit one of those. And he didn't even have his own rifle with him. He had to use a barred rifle. Everybody around said, Dixon's going to shoot at those 15 Indians. And what he did, these things had this sight, as I told you, he got it to maximum. What he had to do was elevate that thing like crazy. The gun would shoot that far, but it had to be an arc. And he was not aiming at a particular guy. He was just trying to hit somebody in that group of 15. And the Indians certainly thought they were safe at 7/8 of a mile. It was surveyed. There were 3 surveys. One of them was 1,028 yards, one of them was 1,538 yards, and one of them was 1,320 yards. Any way you put it, it was a long, long shot, even for a guy who's used to shooting 500 yards. And everybody's watching him, and he's using a barred gun, and he gigged that thing up, and he fired, and lo and behold, knocked the warrior off. It would take 5.3 seconds for that gun to hit. I did a whole chapter on the ballistics of this thing, and they wouldn't even have heard the sound until the bullet had been in the air 4.1 seconds. And then about a second later, somebody got hit, and boy, they scattered. And that was it. The battle pretty much ended. Of course, they were stranded there. They had no animals. But buffalo hunters began to come in, and they got some animals. About 2 weeks after the battle, Billy Dixon was among the people that went to Dodge City. There, he was hired as an Army scout by General Nelson Miles, who was fixing to lead a column. They had columns advance on the panhandle from all 4 directions. And he was hired by General Miles, who was of great fame in the Civil War, and Miles was going to lead the column down from the north. He was hired as a scout at $75 a month. Privates got $13 a month, so you can see it was a very good wage. And he would do that work until 1883. He would scout from then. He was in one major action as they invaded, and when they got to Adobe Walls, General Miles wanted him to lead him around, show him that battle where 28 guys had fought off. The husband, by the way, shot himself with his gun when he was climbing down a ladder. His wife was standing right there. I forgot to tell you about those. All 4 of those guys that were killed there are buried there. So anyway, Billy was asked to run a dispatch to a force in the east. Off he goes, accompanied by another scout named Amos Chapman and an escort of 4 privates. They got almost pretty close to where they were going, and all of a sudden they encountered 125 warriors. And you know, the guys at the Alamo never had these kind of odds. Honest to goodness, there were a couple hundred guys in the Alamo, and they were facing off against 2,000 to 3,000 people. Well, that's bad odds, but it wasn't as bad as the odds at Adobe Walls, nor was it as bad as these odds. One private was killed. He didn't die right away, and everybody else was wounded, including Dixon. And they had no cover at all. They found a buffalo wallow, and they headed for it, and with their, whatever they had, knives and so forth, they kind of piled it up, and that was their cover. And these guys just had regular military weapons, except Billy had his 50 caliber carbine, 50 caliber shorts. And he stood them off a long way. They should have overrun them. And they found out that this private they thought was dead was still alive, so Billy goes running out under fire, gets that guy, and carries him back. He died later in the night. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that action. And so within basically within the summer, from June to September, he fired the most famous shot in the West, and he was ordered given a Medal of Honor for another action. And he was stationed at Fort Elliott, which was out at Mobile. He was stationed there for the rest of his tenure as a scout, nearly 8 years, and from that time he was 24 until he was 32. And then when he was, they didn't need scouts anymore, well, he went back to Adobe Walls and managed to get title to 2 sections, which is 1,280 acres, and he built a 200-tree orchard. He added a little store on his place for cowboys, just candy. There wasn't anything but ranches out there, just candy and tobacco. It became a post office because nobody else lived out there, so he ran the post office. He became a land agent for the state of Texas, and he became a justice of the peace, which they didn't have churches out there. He didn't marry people. He was ferociously shy around girls. But he had a lot of little stuff going on, and he hunted and hunted and hunted. He was crazy about that. And everything was fine, except one day, he got into his 40s, and you know, he had a home there at the fort. You know, he could wear that Medal of Honor on his coat, and there were saloons in town, and the officers loved to include this Medal of Honor winner in their social lives. And then he meets a schoolmarm, It messed up his head. I'll tell you what happened. He had been admiring a girl in that area, but he'd been too shy to even speak to her. That guy was 40-something years old. He wouldn't talk to her. And so one day, this cowboy brings that girl in there, and he says, Mr. Justice of the Peace, would you marry us? And he had to marry the girl he had been dreaming about, you know. And so he did a little bit better with this. Olive King was the 8th of 10 children, born to a Virginia family that had a considerable background. There was a General Lewis who, my goodness, this guy was, he fought in the French and Indian War under Colonel George Washington. He later fought Indians himself during the colonial period, and he was a brigadier general during the Revolution. There's no pictures of him or anything, except there is a fine statue of him in Virginia where he's buried, and there's also his gravestone. And Shay, who was already part of this project, she and her family, in 2 carloads of you guys, right? They made a summer vacation trip up there. And I commissioned her to get pictures, and she did. She went to the cemetery, and she went to the statue. And we've got those 2 images in the book, I think. I haven't seen the book yet. We're supposed to. And so, anyway, everything was fine, except when Olive was 7 years old, had a younger brother, a younger sister and brother. Her daddy died of a smallpox epidemic. And now they're in a mess. They got all these kids. Mama, what's she going to do? They got a worn-out tobacco farm. And so a couple of the older sisters were married. One of the older brothers, who had brought smallpox to the house unknowingly, this guy was already a businessman elsewhere. And so the 2 grandmothers took over, and they divided up the family. And they decreed that an older sister, the next oldest after Olive, should go to live with this married sister that was in another community. And then they said, okay, let's do something with little Olive, who was 7 years old at this point. And they decided not to do anything with her younger brother and sister because they still needed their mama. Well, I would point out that a 7-year-old still needs her mama too. They should have done that. It impacted. But there was a cousin who had married cousin Dora, who had married a well-to-do guy in Decatur, Alabama. And this guy was really something. He was a building contractor, had a great big 2-story house, just 2 old boys. Right catty corner across the street was a Methodist church. And cousin Dora responded to the letter, of course, send the little girl down. And she was welcomed into a wonderful house. And that's where she would wind up growing up through her teen years, from the time she was a child, for nearly a decade. And they put her through school, and when she graduated high school, they begged her to let them send her to college. But she wanted to get back with her family, such as it was. Her cousin, her older brothers, Albert and Archie, had already gone out on the great adventure of the age, and they'd gone to the Texas Panhandle to cowboy. And both of them would eventually become ranchers. And she got home, and there were 6 ladies left at home, counting her, and a little boy. And she decided, oh boy, this was much. Well, she had a sister who had married and who was in another state and who was pregnant. So she went off with her for a while, and when she got back, Archie, cowboy from the Panhandle, had written her that his wife had just had a baby and she needed company, and boy, did she need company. It was... in the census of 1890, Hutchinson County had 9 ranches and 58 people. And so yeah, she needed company. So he sent her money. And she went first to visit cousin Dora in Decatur, and that visit lasted a long time. And then she came to Texas, and she loved it from the start. She loved the Panhandle, the wide open spaces. It was just, it basically was love at first sight in that response. And she was met by her brother, and she went crazy over the place. And after a lengthy visit, she got a job as a school marm, a little old tiny school with 5 students, which included 4 siblings. And so she taught at this log cabin, and she lived with a family. And before long, at that family's home, Billy Dixon, who lived 5 miles away, brought a bundle of laundry And they introduced her, and Mrs. Lewis became a matchmaker, and they ultimately had a wedding in 1894. And there were no churches at all still, but Billy knew of a Methodist circuit rider who lived about 75 miles away. And he wrote to the guy, and the guy said, "I'll come," and he came, and he married him. And they moved into Billy's adobe walls cabin, which had been expanded several times, and they started having kids. Just about a year after they got married, they had their first one. In a 15-year period that followed from December 29th, 1895 to November 18th, 1910, they had 8 kids. No twins, just one at a time. Billy had been love-starved, I guess, for too long. And bear in mind that he was 24 years older than she was. But anyway, they were out in the middle of nowhere. It was very much a pioneer experience for her. But in any event, they got by okay. One baby died in 1901, so they raised 7 children, 4 girls and 3 boys. They moved into, he got bought out by a big ranch, and so they moved 14 miles into the county seat, now a ghost town called Clemens. And then he didn't like town life. There wasn't anybody in that town. It's about 15 houses. He didn't like that, so he decided to homestead in Oklahoma. And he did get a 160-acre homestead right next, the property line was the Texas border. He was as close to Texas as he could get. It didn't work out too well. He worked himself to death doing it. His wife could see him deteriorating. He was a very stout fellow and good looking. He had a big mustache and shoulder-length hair in the style of the plainsman of his day. And he knew how to dress up and so forth. And I don't know if it was premonition or what, but she started taking notes from him, his reminiscences. And she got some of her children's note tablets, and she would go around. She even put one out in the stable. And she got a lot of reminiscences, and then he caught pneumonia and died at the age of 62. They weren't married for 19 years. The wife had 7 kids. The oldest was 17, youngest was 2. And she didn't have any resources at all. I talk a lot in the book about kind of what happened. Sherry found out what happened in Oklahoma, so we did that. And she ultimately sold their little homestead. She moved to Texline, where Billy was buried, then moved to Canyon, where a couple of her older daughters could get teacher certificates, and off they went, and they contributed to the family thing. There's still a bunch of kids at home. Then they moved to Miami, as they say out there, and she loved the Methodist church, which was built while she was there, and the courthouse was there while she was there, and so was the depot, which is now part of the museum. And her kids went to school there and so forth, and she got them graduated, and then she moved to Amarillo and became a newspaper columnist, wrote newspaper articles until 1956, when she died at the age of 83. She was married 19 years. She was a widow for 43 years. And in the interim, she became a foremost historian of the Panhandle. She was an amateur. She didn't have anything but a high school education, but she helped start the Panhandle Plains Historical Society. She raised money and was on the planning committee for Panhandle Plains Museum. That's where her name is above the stove. She got monuments built, big monuments, at Adobe Walls and at the Buffalo Wallow. She got her husband reburied from Texline to the Adobe Walls place, where not only had he won his greatest fame, but where they had lived together. And she just did all kinds of things like that, including in 1923, she went east. She took a trip to the east and to see her family one last time, and while there, she went to meet General Miles, who gave her a handwritten note that is in the museum. At some point in there in the 1910s, the Army decided that they had given away too many medals of honor, and so they wrote to, Billy had been dead a few years at that point, and they wrote to her asking that the Medal of Honor be returned. She just threw the letter away, and the Medal of Honor she later placed in the Panhandle Plains Museum where it is today. And So she was really something. If you know anything about General Custer, his wife did much to commemorate, to memorialize, to preserve his fame. She did the same thing for Billy Dixon, and she was a wonderful lady, and I didn't get very far into the story before I thought, I gotta write about her too. And I thought, well, for once, I'm not writing just about gunfights and things. For once, I'm writing about something that women may want to read. and so we would happily sell your books today for your reading pleasure, except we don't have any. So in any event, that's a bit of the story that I tried to tell, and I had a great time putting it together. You know, I had a wonderful time out there. And I had a wonderful time playing with all those buffalo guns. Thank you so much for coming, and we will try our best. If you're interested in the book, we will certainly try our best to get it to you as conveniently and as quickly as possible. So.